There was a time when my wardrobe looked complete, even reassuring at first glance, but every morning told a different story. I would open it, move a few hangers aside, and pause. Not because I had nothing to wear, but because there were too many choices, and somehow none of them felt quite right. It wasn't frustration exactly. It was quieter than that. Just a small weight that showed up each morning, as if something simple had slowly become more complicated than it needed to be. And yet, without thinking, I kept reaching for the same few things. One morning, I noticed it clearly. I already knew what I was going to wear before I even chose. And that led to a simple question that stayed with me. If I already know what works, why am I holding on to the rest? I didn't rush into a big change. I just started paying attention. And over time, without forcing anything, my wardrobe became smaller, until I was left with around 10 pieces I truly wore. And what surprised me wasn't the number. It was how calm everything began to feel. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And if you enjoy these kinds of quiet, thoughtful conversations, you can like the video or subscribe. It helps others who are looking for a calmer way to live find something that feels steady and reassuring. Now, those 10 items didn't appear all at once. They revealed themselves slowly. And the first one was something I had overlooked for years, precisely because it seemed so ordinary. It was just a shirt. Nothing remarkable about it at all. No bold color, no special design, nothing that would stand out in any way. In fact, if you saw it hanging among other clothes, you might not notice it at all, but I kept reaching for it. Not because I told myself to, not because it was my favorite in any obvious way, but because it was always the easiest choice. It felt comfortable the moment I put it on, and once it was on, I didn't think about it again. That was the difference. Before this, I had shirts that looked good, at least in theory, the kind you feel pleased about when you first buy them, but over time, they start to require attention. You adjust the sleeves, you notice how they sit when you move, you become slightly aware of them throughout the day. I remember visiting a friend once, wearing one of those shirts I thought I liked. We were sitting and talking, and at some point I realized I had been adjusting it over and over again without even noticing. I laughed quietly to myself, because it suddenly felt unnecessary. Why should something as simple as a shirt require that much attention? That moment stayed with me, because clothing, at its best, should not demand your energy. It should support you quietly, and then step out of the way. So instead of searching for something better, something more stylish or more impressive, I began to value what already worked. That shirt wasn't special, but it was reliable, and I began to see that reliability mattered far more than having many options that didn't quite fit. The second item followed a similar pattern, though I didn't recognize its importance right away. It was a pair of trousers that felt easy in a way that didn't need explanation, not just when I first put them on, but throughout the entire day. I could wear them for hours without adjusting them, or without becoming aware of them, without that quiet feeling that I would rather be wearing something else. And that made me pause, because before that, I had accepted a certain level of discomfort as normal. Clothes that were fine at first, but slowly became tiring. Clothes that looked right, but didn't feel right. I remember wearing a different pair once, thinking they looked quite good when I left the house. But by the time I returned, I found myself looking forward to taking them off. Not because they were terrible, but because they weren't easy. And that's when something became clear. Good enough is not always good enough for everyday life. We often keep things because they are still usable, still presentable, still acceptable. But if they quietly make your day harder, even in small ways, that effect builds over time. And so I began to use that comfortable pair as a quiet standard, not a strict rule, not something rigid, but a reference point. If something didn't feel as easy as that, I began to question it gently, not removing it immediately, not forcing a decision, just noticing. And over time, the answer became clearer on its own. The third item was something I had overlooked completely for a long time, a light outer layer, something I could put on without thinking when the weather changed slightly. Before, I had several options, some too heavy, some too formal, some that simply didn't fit into my everyday routine. And because of that, even choosing something simple like an extra layer became a small decision I had to think through. But this one was different. It worked with what I already wore. It felt comfortable. It didn't require me to stop and ask whether it matched. It just did. And that small detail removed one more decision from my day. Before, even something as simple as stepping out could involve a brief pause. Should I wear this or that? Does this go with what I have on? But now there was no pause. And when those small decisions begin to disappear, your mornings begin to feel different. You move more easily, with less hesitation, and without realizing it, you begin your day with a sense of clarity. If you take a moment to think about your own wardrobe, you may already recognize this pattern. There are pieces you reach for without effort, and others that remain there, even though you rarely choose them. You don't have to change anything right away. Just noticing is enough, because once you see it clearly, the next step often follows naturally. And I'd be interested to hear, what is one item you find yourself wearing again and again, almost without thinking? Those small, consistent choices often reveal more than everything else combined. As these first few items became clearer to me, something else began to fade quietly, the need to constantly decide. And in its place, there was a sense of ease that didn't draw attention to itself, but made everything feel lighter. And this, I realized, was only the beginning. By the time those first few pieces had quietly settled into place, something deeper had already begun to change. And it wasn't just about what I was wearing, but about how I was beginning to see everything that remained in my wardrobe. Before this shift, I used to think of my clothes as separate choices, on each one standing on its own, waiting to be selected, matched, or justified in some way. Every morning felt like a small exercise in decision-making, even when I didn't realize it. But gradually, that way of thinking started to fade, and I began to see my wardrobe as something more connected, something that either worked together with ease or created quiet friction. That simple shift in perspective made the next few items much easier to recognize, almost as if they had been there all along, waiting for me to finally notice them properly. The fourth item was a pair of shoes that had been part of my daily life for quite some time, yet I had never really considered their importance until I paused and observed my own habits more carefully. These were not the shoes I bought for special outings or occasions, and they were certainly not the kind that stayed neatly tucked away, waiting for the right moment to be worn. Instead, they were always nearby, usually placed close to the door, ready to be slipped on without a second thought. What struck me, once I paid attention, was how often I chose them, not because I had decided to, but because they were simply the easiest option. They worked with everything I wore. They felt comfortable from the moment I stepped into them. And most importantly, they never demanded my attention throughout the day. I remember one particular moment when I decided, almost out of a sense of obligation, to wear a different pair, one I had kept for no clear reason other than the feeling that I should use it more often. It didn't take long before I became aware of the difference. I noticed how I walked, how I adjusted my steps slightly, how my attention kept returning to something that should have remained unnoticed. And I couldn't help but find it quietly amusing, because once again, I found myself asking a familiar question. Why was I making something so simple more complicated than it needed to be? That realization stayed with me, and it made the decision surprisingly easy. I stopped trying to rotate through options just to justify keeping them, and instead allowed that one dependable pair to take its natural place in my daily routine. Not because it was perfect, but because it quietly supported my day without asking anything in return. The fifth item revealed itself in a more personal and subtle way, and it had nothing to do with what I wore outside. It was something I wore at home, so something I had never really considered important enough to think about. For a long time, I treated my home clothes as an afterthought, wearing whatever was left, older items, mismatched pieces, things that had gradually been replaced but not removed. It seemed harmless at first because, after all, no one else would see them. But over time, I began to notice something I hadn't expected. The way I dressed at home influenced how I felt, even in the quietest moments when no one else was around. If what I wore felt worn out or uncomfortable, there was a subtle effect on my mood, not strong enough to demand attention, but present enough to shape how I experienced my day. It was like sitting in a chair that was slightly uneven. You could manage it, but it was never truly comfortable. So I made a small but meaningful adjustment. And instead of leaving my home clothes to chance, I chose them with intention, focusing on comfort, simplicity, and consistency. I chose something that felt right the moment I put it on, something that didn't need to be adjusted, something that allowed me to feel at ease in my own space, and that small change had a noticeable effect. My mornings felt more settled, my afternoons more relaxed, and my evenings more consistent. It was as if I had quietly aligned my surroundings with the way I wanted to feel, even in the most ordinary moments. The sixth item required a different kind of attention, not practical, but emotional in a quiet, understated way. It was something I had held on to for longer than I needed to, not because I used it, but because it represented a different time in my life, a version of myself that I had not fully let go of. If for a long time, it remained in my wardrobe, not worn, but not removed either. It carried a quiet sense of maybe someday, even though deep down, I knew that the life it belonged to was no longer part of my present. Every time I saw it, there was a small, almost unnoticeable hesitation, a question that lingered without being fully acknowledged. One day, instead of avoiding that feeling, I chose to face it directly. And rather than asking whether I still like the item, I asked something more honest and far more useful. Does this belong in my life as it is today? The answer, once I allowed myself to be truthful, became clear without any need for further debate. Letting it go did not feel like a loss, nor did it require a dramatic moment of decision. It felt more like a quiet acknowledgement that life changes, and that it is perfectly natural for our surroundings to change with it. This experience extended beyond clothing, because we all carry items that belong to earlier chapters of our lives. Things we no longer use but have not yet released, often because we have not taken the time to question them. And once I did, I felt something shift, not because I had less, but because I had removed something that no longer aligned with who I was now. The seventh item was, in many ways, the simplest to understand, yet one of the most impactful. It was a piece that worked effortlessly with everything else I owned, removing the need for careful matching or planning. Before this, getting dressed often felt like solving a small puzzle, figuring out which pieces worked together, which combinations made sense, and which ones didn't. But this one item changed that entirely. It fit naturally with everything else, allowing me to think less about individual outfits and more about how everything connected as a whole. This shift reduced effort in a way that was almost surprising. Instead of standing in front of my wardrobe trying to decide what worked, I found myself reaching for items with a quiet certainty, knowing that they would fit together without needing adjustment. It reminded me of a well-organized kitchen, where a few reliable tools can handle almost everything, removing the need for excess while still allowing for flexibility. That is what this item became, not just another piece of clothing, but something that brought everything else together in a way that felt complete. If you take a moment to reflect on your own home, you may notice similar patterns. There are always items that quietly support your daily life, making things easier without drawing attention to themselves, and others that remain unused, waiting for a purpose that rarely comes. There is no need to rush into changing anything, but there is value in noticing. Noticing what feels easy, noticing what feels like effort, noticing what truly supports you. And if you would like to share, you might consider this question. Have you ever kept something, not because you needed it, but because it reminded you of a different time in your life? Sometimes simply recognizing that is enough to begin letting go. By this point, my wardrobe was no longer crowded, but more importantly, it was no longer confusing. Each piece had a place, each piece had a purpose, and getting dressed had returned to being a simple, steady part of the day rather than something that required thought or effort. The changes in my wardrobe had already begun to influence something deeper, something that extended beyond clothing and into the rhythm of my everyday life. What started as a simple observation about what I wore had gradually turned into a quiet shift in how I experienced my mornings, my home, and even my sense of ease throughout the day. Getting dressed was no longer something I had to think through. It didn't feel like a small task waiting to be solved each morning. Instead, it became something familiar, almost automatic in the most comforting way, like making a cup of tea or opening a window to let in fresh air. And in that simplicity, something else began to appear, a steady, quiet kind of confidence. Not the kind that draws attention, and not the kind that depends on appearance, but the kind that comes from knowing that things simply work the way they should. The eighth item reflected this change in a way I hadn't expected. It was a set of home clothes chosen not as an afterthought, but with the same level of care as everything else in my wardrobe. For a long time, I had treated what I wore at home as something secondary, something that didn't really matter because it was not seen by others. But over time, I came to understand that what we wear in private shapes how we feel just as much as what we wear in public. Before this, I would often wear older clothes at home, items that had been replaced but not removed, pieces that no longer felt quite right but were still good enough for staying in. It seemed harmless, sure, but there was always a subtle sense of discomfort, a feeling that things were slightly out of place. So I made a simple change. I chose a small number of home clothes that felt comfortable, consistent, and easy to wear. Not fancy, not elaborate, just reliable and well-suited to the quiet moments of the day. And that change had a noticeable effect. Mornings felt more settled, afternoons more relaxed, evenings more consistent. It was as though I had aligned my surroundings with the way I wanted to feel, even when no one else was there to notice. It reminded me of something simple, like keeping a room tidy even when no one is visiting. You don't do it for others. You do it because of how it makes you feel. The ninth item was not something I added to my wardrobe, but something I removed from my habits. It was the habit of adding without thinking. Before, it was easy to bring new things into my wardrobe. A shirt that looked appealing, a piece that felt like a small improvement, something that seemed useful in the moment. None of these decisions felt significant on their own, but over time, they created the very clutter I had worked to reduce. So instead of setting strict rules, I introduced a pause. Whenever I considered bringing something new into my wardrobe, I stopped and asked myself a few simple questions. Where would this fit in my daily life? Would I actually wear it often? Would it work with what I already have? And perhaps most importantly, would it replace something or simply add to what was already enough? That pause changed everything. It didn't feel restrictive. It didn't feel like I was denying myself anything. Instead, it felt like I was protecting something I had already created. Because once you experience that sense of ease, that quiet clarity, you begin to value it in a different way. You become less interested in adding more and more interested in maintaining what already works. It reminded me of clearing a surface in the home, perhaps a table or a kitchen counter. At first, it feels open and calm, but if you are not mindful, things slowly begin to return, one item at a time, until the space is filled again without you quite noticing how it happened. That same pattern can appear in a wardrobe, not all at once but gradually, and that simple habit of pausing helped me prevent it. The 10th and final piece was not something I could hang in a wardrobe or place on a shelf. It was a routine, a very simple one. Instead of treating getting dressed as something I needed to decide each morning, I allowed it to become familiar. There were a few combinations I trusted, a few simple choices that I knew would work without effort. So rather than standing in front of my wardrobe, thinking through options and trying to decide, I simply reached in, chose something I already knew felt right, and continued with my day. And that small shift had a lasting effect. Because every decision you don't have to make gives you something in return. A little more space, a little more energy, a little more clarity, and over time, those small gains add up in a way that is surprisingly meaningful. You begin your day without that quiet hesitation. You move forward more easily, and that ease becomes part of how you carry yourself, not just in what you wear, but in how you approach everything else. When I step back and look at the entire process, I realize that this was never really about reducing a wardrobe to 10 items. That was simply the outcome. What it was really about was removing the small points of friction that quietly build up in daily life. The unnecessary choices, the items that no longer reflect who you are, the habits that add noise instead of ease. And what remains is something much simpler, a wardrobe that supports you, a routine that feels natural, a home that allows you to move through your day without unnecessary effort. You may begin to notice this in other areas as well. A drawer that opens easily because there is space inside it, a shelf where everything has a purpose, a table that can be used immediately without needing to clear it first. These may seem like small details, but they shape how a home feels, and more importantly, how you feel within it. If you are thinking about your own wardrobe or any part of your home, there is no need to rush. You don't have to reduce everything. You don't have to aim for a specific number. You can begin with something small, one drawer, one section, one group of items, and simply notice what feels easy, what feels like effort, what you return to, and what you avoid. That awareness is often enough to guide the next step. And if you would like to reflect on it, you might ask yourself this: what is one part of your home that already feels calm and easy? Sometimes recognizing what works is just as important as changing what doesn't. Over time, what I found was not just a smaller wardrobe, but a quieter way of living. The less adjusting, less deciding, less holding on to things that no longer belong. And in that space, there was more room for clarity, more room for comfort, and a steady kind of confidence that didn't need to be announced or explained. It was simply there. If this conversation has been helpful to you in some way, you can like the video, subscribe, or share it with someone who might be looking for a calmer, more thoughtful approach to their home. And take your time with it. There is no rush. A quieter home and an easier day often begin with the smallest changes,